Welcome back to another episode of the 6Ps podcast. Today, we are going to be focusing on essay writing when looking at the longest memory and the 7 stages of grieving. To give you a bit of an overview about the SAC and the exam in Year 12 when it comes to comparative, you're writing an essay, obviously, and it should be about 900 to 1200 words approximately. I reckon you'll find this is the longest essay that you write. Why? It's pretty simple. You're dealing with 2 texts rather than just one, as we do for the text response. Now in Unit 4, this is worth 60 of the 100 marks, and it's obviously worth a third of your Year 12 exam mark as well. So this is the weightiest text type that you actually do. At Year 11, it's worth 50 marks of Unit 2 as well. So just a heads up about that if you are studying this at Year 11. Looking at the rubric, this is for the SAC, of course, and the reason I'm going to touch on this is because it's slightly different to the exam. But the main focus here is that the top half is all about your knowledge of the text and your ability to compare the 2 texts using a range of evidence, looking at themes and characters and so forth. The third quarter is all about your ability to structure a comparative response. And the last point is one that we see all the time in English. It's your written expression and fluency. To give you a bit of a breakdown as a difference between medium and very high, I've sort of highlighted words that describe your ability. So for example, to get in the medium range, we're looking at satisfactory and relevant knowledge of the text, as opposed to sophisticated and highly significant connections. Rather than clear and appropriate comparison, we want sustained and insightful comparison. And rather than suitable evidence, we want considered use of textual evidence. For the structure, we want to try and be more skillful than sound, and we want to be highly expressive and fluent and coherent rather than simply generally fluent and coherent. So we'll talk a little bit about how we go from that medium range, that very high range, a little bit later on. As I said, I really wanted to touch on what VCAA say. This is from the 2020 exam, and it says here that most students are well aware of the requirements of this section. The 4 assessment criteria require students to demonstrate selective textual knowledge and an appreciation of the core ideas and issues in paired text to explore meaningful textual connections. That means similarities or differences in response to the topic, and to reveal control of language to facilitate such comparison. As in all sections of the examination, assessment is holistic. Hence, student capacity to develop a coherent and cogent essay that directly addresses the chosen topic and is substantiated by sharp textual comparison is rewarded. Note here that addresses the chosen topic. Now, this isn't necessarily in the rubric for the SAC, but it's definitely something that will be the focus in the exam. So making sure you are responding to the topic. The last point is one about the structure, and this is important because there is no preferred or stipulated style of essay writing for section B. So the way you compare the texts, there are a range of ways that you could do it. We're going to look at 1 or 2 today, but I need to stress that and make sure that you all understand that there's no sort of right way to go about this. And it says here, rather, students should adopt the approach that most adeptly enables them to compare the ideas and issues that are central to the topic with meaning, clarity, and control. When it comes to the exam, these 3 things are important. Your text knowledge and your ability to write, and making sure both those aspects are always in response to the essay topic. The essay topic is just so important. Why? Well, a couple of reasons. It's a skill, but also we do see quite a few students pre-prepare essays in the lead up to an exam, and it's often really obvious when they do it because essay topics are really considered in the way that the questions are asked. Every single word is really, really important. So making sure you're addressing all aspects of the topic is really hard to do in advance if you don't know what it actually is. To that effect, let's remember that acronym. RTFQ, ATFQ. Read the question, answer the question. And if you're not too sure what the F stands for, I'll give you 5 seconds to come up with the answer. Let's look at the steps in terms of addressing an essay topic. Now, You should have seen essay topics before. You would have seen them with text response, and it's a little bit similar. Actually, if anything, the comparative topics are often a little bit broader based on the fact that you are dealing with two texts that are quite different to an extent. So most of the time, the essay topics will be quite broad, and sometimes I'll even come with a quotation from each text. If that's the case, you should definitely be using those quotations in your essay and treat them as that, free quotations. The first thing you want to do is definitely select your topic, because you always get two. Use your reading time and make sure you've picked one that you can respond to with the most depth and detail in terms of your knowledge of the text. Make sure you consider the key terms and phrases, and then formulate a contention, or a clear contention I should say, which covers the topic. From there, you want to formulate what your 3 or 4 main body paragraphs are going to be about. That means arguments or ideas that support that contention. If you're struggling for ideas, maybe consider evidence. I mean, you can't write a detailed main body paragraph without evidence, so maybe work backwards. Think about what evidence you want to use, and from there, maybe formulate some arguments. I like to jot down a quick plan or skeleton. Essentially, what are my 3 topic sentences and what quotations am I going to use? Now, if you have reading time, see if you can do this in your head. If not, as I say, feel free to write it down on a piece of paper, but you won't get marked on it. Once you've got a clear idea though of where you're going, that's when you can begin writing your essay. The practice topic we're going to look at today is actually from last year's VCAA exam. It's topic number 1. Compare how these texts show the world to be a place where hope is always present. Thinking about key terms, we've got the world, we've got the word hope, and always present. All in all, the key word here is hope. That's the main theme we're going to focus on, and we want to make sure that whatever ideas we come up with, whatever arguments and evidence we come up with, we're always going back to this idea of hope being present in the settings the texts have. So as I said before, when it comes to planning, make sure you have a clear contention which covers all aspects of the essay topic. Now, if you're stuck for ideas, what I like to do is add the word because on the end of my contention. That way, it gives you a bit of a nudge in terms of how you can structure your essay. What 3 ideas can you use in order to support that contention? If you're still stuck, as I said, think about evidence and work backwards. And even then, if you're still stuck, well, think about the other key themes and ideas and see how they relate to the topic. For me, when I first saw this topic, I immediately thought of, well, how was hope initially depicted as being present? And then how is it ultimately presented? For me, I felt that both texts were sort of devoid with a bit of hope initially, due to the power imbalance or the oppression of authorities, due to the fact that minorities were quite subservient. I thought also about suffering and grief, how there's a lack of hope due to this, not just as well, I should say, within minorities, but also characters who have a little bit of power. I was thinking, for example, of, say, Sanders Sr. and the grief that he feels and the suffering he feels following his wife's death. Another idea I thought of was shame. The reason why is, in the back of my head, I've got this example of shame, or these examples for shame, being Mr. Whitechapel from the novel and the brother from the play. Now, this is one of those sort of example comparisons that I know really, really well, and I'm going to try and shoehorn it into an essay if I can. Now, that's not to say that I can shoehorn it into every single essay topic, but I feel this is one where the idea of shame works really well with this idea of hope being present in both the worlds. So I'm thinking about looking at 2 of those ideas about how hope is initially depicted as not being so present, but ultimately, I reckon it is quite present within both texts. And how is that done? Well, it's done through a few things. I think characters being able to unburden their grief allows them to feel hope for the future. Same to having clear dreams or aspirations, so too does having love and support from family. Feeling a sense of anger and defiance is an emotion, I guess, or an action that characters take in order to gain a sense of optimism or hope or even control over their future, as well as that feeling of a sense of justice. So for me, I'm sort of going to break this down into sort of 2 sections. How is it initially depicted and how is it ultimately depicted in the text? I should say text, there's 2 of them. Here's a little planner that I made. Now, please don't look at this and go, oh my goodness, I've got to write 6 main body paragraphs. That's not right. I gave myself sort of 5 minutes of reading time to work out a bit of a plan on how I might want to go about this. I'm only going to use 3 main body paragraphs. I'm only going to use 3 ideas. But what this does is it allows me to get all my ideas down on paper and then pick the best ones. And also pick what sequence I'm going to address them in as well, because that's important too. VCAA in the exam report for last year's exam mentioned they wanted really well-structured and considered arguments. So think about what's in your first, second and third main body paragraph and how they interconnect to one another. For me, I want to start with this idea about oppressive and corrupt authorities that quell any sense of hope in minorities. For me, I'm looking at the authority figures like Sanders Senior and the Virginian, being the newspaper, and victims like Chappell, for example, who doesn't have any hope for the future because of the situation he finds himself in. Now, obviously, he has a sense of hope briefly, but really, he doesn't really have any, and especially, I should say, because we know that he dies at the beginning of the text, and that's where you might want to bring in the dramatic irony and the tension in the text, given that his death opens the novel. In the 7 stages of grieving, this is where I can focus on those institutions like the police, government, and legal systems. And I could even focus on someone like Nana, who was fearful of these institutions. As I said to you before, I really wanted to focus on the idea of shame, and this is where I could compare Mr. Whitechapel with the character of Brother from the play. And this idea for my last main body paragraph to go against this idea that there is limited hope to being actually there is hope for those who are defiant, who speak up, who are activists, and who are rebellious as well. So thinking about Chappell here and thinking about the great-granddaughter and her dreams for Africa, and thinking about the activism in the 7 stages of grieving, the reconciliation walk and the march following Daniel Vock's death might be really good examples for me to use. I've got examples for the other ideas as well. And again, I'm going to pick ideas where I have strong evidence for. That's really important. But there are other ideas that I haven't referenced that might be good to look at as well. We spoke the other day about language being a really good example to use, and perhaps something like Western constructs being something that diminish hope in the world for minority groups. That could be an idea that you might focus on for this particular essay topic. Also, I should say, there are definitely no right or wrong arguments for you to pick from. You could write an essay that gets 10 out of 10 that picks none of these ideas at all. So please be mindful of the fact that there's no answer sheet here. The idea is that you are answering to a particular topic in a detailed, in-depth way that compares how your ideas and how the essay topic is explored in both the texts. As I said before, there's no one way to go about it, but this is how I like to go about it. This is my basic structure. It's just like a text response essay. I've got an introduction, 3 main bodies, and a conclusion. In each main body paragraph, I'm going to look at both texts, and ideally, I'd love to explore both similarities and differences in every main body paragraph to again show that sophisticated and skillful ability to compare between texts. So let's focus on the actual essay writing itself, and we'll start with the introduction. This is again a bit of a template. And this is one of the many ways that you can go about it. For me, I really like to introduce the texts first and provide a bit of context or setting detail. Once I do that, I can then go into my contention or thesis statement and make sure I address the topic. And once I've done that, I want to signpost my arguments or my ideas. As I said, this is one way to go about it. Other people really like to bring up their contention straight away to remind the examiner that they are definitely thinking about the essay topic. So once again, no hard and fast rules about how you might want to go about this. This is just one way that you could effectively outline your contention and arguments in an introduction. Let's look at this first introduction. The Longest Memory and the 7 Stages of Grieving both explore the theme of hope. In The Longest Memory, many of the characters, including Whitechapel and Chappell, try and hold on to hope as a way of dealing with racism. In the 7 Stages of Grieving, there is not a lot of hope to start with. However, by the end, the woman is full of hope and optimism for a world free from racism and discrimination. All in all, both texts showcase hope following on from grief and trauma. Bit of feedback on this. They've ticked a few boxes. They've addressed the topic to an extent. They've introduced both texts as well, and they've got some arguments. However, it's not directly on topic. They don't address all aspects of the essay topic. I also don't like the fact they brought in the examples. I think examples are really important to use as evidence in your main body paragraph. I'm not saying don't reference a character in your introduction, because sometimes it does work, but for me personally, I like to save my characters and use them as evidence in my main body paragraphs. Something else is the expression. It's a little bit informal at times, and the vocabulary is also a little bit repetitive. So make sure you're using things like synonyms or different sentence structures to ensure that your writing is sophisticated and skillful. Let's look at introduction 2 now. As you can probably guess visually, it's slightly better. Now this is one that was provided by VCAA for last year's exam. The repercussions of centuries of injustice, dispossession and subjugation has left painful wounds, of which the effects continue to reverberate today. Both Fred Dubois' harrowing novella, The Longest Memory, and Wesley Enoch and Deborah Mailman's confronting play, The 7 Stages of Grieving, convey the brutal worlds in which hope is sometimes present and afforded to individuals. Each polyphonic narrative explores the crushing brutality which presents worlds seemingly absent of all hope as they have forced individuals to succumb. However, the few spirited acts of rebellion and defiance shown suggest that hope somehow remains present within each world. So this is a really effective introduction. They've done a couple of things here. They've got a really clear contention that really highlights all aspects of the topic. So you've got the word the worlds, and in fact they've described them as the brutal worlds. They've got the key theme of hope and the notion of it being present, in this case sometimes present. They follow on a little bit from my plan, talking a little bit about how it's initially depicted, but suggesting that there is hope in the world, and that goes to their last main body paragraph, I'm going to assume there. Something else I hope that you've noticed is their vocabulary and their expression, which is much stronger than the previous introduction. Something to note though is using big words isn't always effective, because sometimes that can impact on your fluency. So make sure if you're trialing any new vocabulary, in order to look or in order to have your writing to be a little bit more sophisticated, make sure you use it correctly and appropriately in your writing. Let's look at main body paragraphs now. These are going to be pretty similar to ones that you would have seen in the text response essay. Now, topic sentences should do 3 things: include both texts, present a key idea, and be relevant to the essay topic. That is so important. Now, evidence, it should be quite varied, and we want to avoid retelling the plot or being too character heavy. I'd also like you to focus on the how as well as the what. So not just what happens in the text, but how that story is told. So looking at things like, stage directions, the nonlinear structure, any symbols and motifs that occur throughout the text. These are really important to showcase a strong and detailed knowledge of the text. And with your analysis, well, you really want to link your evidence to your ideas and to the essay topic itself, and making sure you showcase to the examiner that your evidence is relevant. You want to avoid repeating yourself as well, so avoid repeating your analysis or even vocabulary, and always be relevant to the idea and the essay topic. With topic sentences, I think the main thing, as I said before, is to directly engage and relate to the essay topic itself. And this can mean using synonyms to make sure you're not repeating vocab. Make sure your topic sentence has a clear focus area or idea, and make sure you're covering both texts. With your sentence starters, these are a couple that I like to use: the text explore, Dubois, Enoch and Mailman present, and the longest memory and the 7 stages of grieving examine. Before I go on, what I should say is these topic sentences are for the structure where you're covering both texts in each main body paragraph. So I just wanted to reiterate that. If you're looking at one text each for main body 1 and main body 2, then doing comparative as your third main body paragraph, this might not relate to you, but I think it's really important. Personally, I think it's a good safety net to have comparison in each main body paragraph, particularly if you run out of time. And just to reiterate, these are the topic sentence verbs that we like to use. My 3 favorites are explore, examine, and present. They're quite safe, I guess, verbs to really use. But again, if you want to use any others, you definitely can. In fact, this is not a complete and exhaustive list of verbs for a topic sentence. There are many more that you could definitely use. I just find these really useful to get my idea out in a nice, clear, effective manner. So let's look at evidence, and I guess the most important thing that you need to be using is quotations, and you want to make sure you are, of course, embedding these fluently. I think it's really good to include language features as well, and use meta-language where possible, whether that's the nonlinear structure, the multiple narrative voices, the symbols and motifs, whatever it is you're using, make sure you use that meta-language. Verbs are great to use as well. You know, what does Deborah utilize? What do Enoch and Mailman employ, and so forth. And symbols and context details can obviously also be used as evidence. We're not simply relying just on quotations. So that effect, this is a bit of an evidence pyramid. The reason I use this is because I think the plot is very basic and I want students to be more complex. So thinking about characters and themes, but especially thinking about the historical context, and most important, thinking about symbols, language, structural and stylistic features, as well as the authorial intent. That very bottom section is really important to include somewhere within your essay because it shows sophistication and complexity in your ability to analyse the texts. With your explanation, obviously you want to always ensure you are explaining how your evidence relates to your paragraph topic as well as the essay prompt as well. Now, you should be using verbs to ensure that you do this. Verbs like, illustrate, highlight, elucidate, and so forth are really good for that. And we'll have a verb list coming up a little bit later on. Consider using the author's names and exploring their authorial intent when you do this as well. I think authors' names are great to use as, once again, signpost the fact that you're analysing, and you want to avoid repeating your analysis as well. And sometimes we can fall into that trap of saying the same thing 2 or even 3 times in a main body paragraph. So really think about how you're going to analyse the examples before you do so to avoid doing that. And here are those explanation verbs. As I said, my sort of favourites: highlights, illustrates, underscores. Those are a couple of my favourite ones that I like to use. But again, play around with these and see which ones are going to work best for you. In terms of authorial intent, these are the 2 questions you should be considering. What messages are the authors challenging, and what messages or what ideas are the authors promoting? So what do they think is good and what do they think is bad, or the other way around? What don't they like and what do they like? And think about how they're doing that through the text. How are these ideas conveyed? And here's some vocab for you. I've obviously used the film Marbo as the example here, but the left-hand side are those positive verbs for authorial intent. So what positive messages are the authors promoting, endorsing, celebrating, championing, and supporting? And on the other hand, what ideas are they condemning, challenging, critiquing, questioning, and denouncing? Now, linking sentences, really important. You want to make sure you are connecting your paragraph topic back to the essay topic. Now, this can be done at the end of each main body paragraph, of course. If you feel like you are able to, you can sort of weave your link in through your analysis. But again, that's something that can be a little bit tricky and fraught with if you don't know what you're doing. Now, it is very similar to your topic sentence. So this is where you should be considering using synonyms, so words with the same meaning, or even a different sentence structure to ensure you're not repeating yourself. And once again, this confirms, our linking sentences confirm to the examiner that we are reading the question and that we are answering the question itself. This is a bit of a template for a main body paragraph. This is how I like to do it. So my topic sentence and my linking sentence cover both texts. I've got my 7 stages of grieving first, followed by the longest memory. It doesn't matter which order you do this in, as long as you are consistent with the way that you do it. Now, if my first examples are similarities, I might then go in that little green box and look at the differences, or vice versa if I'm doing it. But this is optional. For me, I think good complex comparison is both similarities and differences with the same ideas. But I understand at the same time, you don't want to be writing about a difference for the sake of writing about a difference if it doesn't add anything to your analysis. So please be really considered in how you write your main body paragraphs. This is a slightly different structure, but relatively similar. It's where you're weaving in the similarities and differences, and you're, as you can see here, you're sort of doing it, weaving it in more subtly here as you do this, while keeping that topic sentence and linking sentence covering both the texts as well. All right, let's look at comparative vocab. And this is really important because it signposts to the examiner that you are comparing the two texts. So to express similarity, you might use a connective like similarly, in the same way, or likewise. And then there's some verbs below that. So verbs like corroborates, echoes, endorses, parallels, promotes, reflects, shares, supports, and upholds are really easy ways to make sure you are making those connections. I think that verb list particularly is underrated. I think so many students simply focus on those connectives and feel like they're doing their comparison, but those verbs work really well to just strengthen that comparison. To express difference, some of those connectives could be in contrast, conversely, or on the other hand, and they're the verbs below. Challenges, contradicts, condemns, conveys an alternative perspective, opposes, questions, repudiates, and undermines. So this is if the ideas in both texts are different. And once again, those verbs work really, really well just to underscore to the examiner that you are comparing the two texts. So let's look at 3 main body paragraph samples and we'll give some feedback on each. The first one, both the 7 stages of grieving and the longest memory present oppressive societies bound by systemic racism and imbalances of power. As a result, minorities are devoid of hope and forced to submit to unjust social hierarchies. The play opens with stage directions describing the faint sound of someone crying in the dark to hint at the perpetual grief faced by First Nations people, which is continually hidden and suppressed by authorities. The fear of powerful institutions is reflected in Nana, who got nervous at the mention of the government. While 2 contrasting characters, Enoch and Mailman employs one performer, the woman, as a reflection of the wider experiences of First Nations people's suffering and trauma, leaving them hopeless and voiceless. In a similar way, Whitechapel, in the longest memory, loses all sense of hope following his son's death. He tries to forget this memory, but finds it too traumatic and must wait for death to save him. Therefore, both texts present oppression as a way to remove hope from others. So here's my feedback on this particular paragraph. The topic sentence is clear and relevant. You'll notice here they've used sort of 2 topic sentences. So hope isn't mentioned in the first sentence, but definitely in the second sentence. They've used quotations, which is really good, but I just felt they lacked balance in their evidence. There was much more focus on the first text, on the play, than there was the novel, and it felt quite rushed at the end. There was really limited analysis of the longest memory. And something I should say as well is the analysis there was quite simplistic and quite basic. Their expression too was a bit inconsistent. So once again, making sure we're proofreading our paragraphs and making any changes that we need to ensure that fluency. All right, let's look at main body example 2. Going back to our planner, this is the paragraph focusing on shame. While external forces leave some individuals hopeless in both the 7 stages of grieving and the longest memory, there are also intrinsic feelings, such as shame, which can become barriers. In the play, the woman's brother is unable to break the cycle of crime, addiction and poverty because of the shame he feels from his father. Here, Enoch and Mailman point out the high incarceration rates among Indigenous youths and, as a result, critique the inequality and brutality of the Australian justice systems. There's an ellipsis there because I've left a bit of this paragraph out because it was too long for the slide. In a similar fashion, Mr. Whitechapel also feels a sense of indignity towards his father when entering the gentleman's club in the novel. Echoing the play, the phrase shame is repeated to emphasise its incapacitating nature to the extent that Mr. Whitechapel cannot live with shame. It is not until his enslaved human, Whitechapel, is praised for his loyalty that the plantation owner is now without shame due to another's noble and honourable deeds, providing hope that he will overcome his grief. Given his position of power, Mr. Whitechapel has the capacity to reclaim his sense of self-respect and dignity. For the brother in the play, however, he's unable to break his feeling of embarrassment and hopelessness. By not providing the brother with a name, the playwright suggests this is a widespread experience and that it can happen to anyone. By closing the scene, by highlighting the family still wondering what's going to happen, any chance of an optimistic ending for the brother appears unlikely. Therefore, both the play and the novel explore the relationship between hope and shame. Bit of feedback on this. I felt the topic sentence was a bit more nuanced in this case. It was a bit more complex in the way that it answers to the essay topic. There was a wide range of evidence used here as well. They weren't just focused on quotations. They had some other evidence as well. Authorial intent was covered in good detail there as well, with that reference to the incarceration rates. And there was a complex structure. They looked at similarities and then differences throughout the text. So for me, this is a stronger paragraph, a much stronger paragraph, I should say, than the previous one. And let's have a look at this last main body paragraph. Both texts convey the contrasting effects of racism leading to idealism, hope and demand for change by most victims to it. The three authors condemn their depicted societies for oppressive and racist values driven by manipulative and violent authorities. However, in closing with the real historic event of the 2000 reconciliation walk over Sydney Harbour Bridge, Enoch and Mailman provide a sense of realism when presenting the audience with hope for the future. The added simile of the woman describing the crowd looking like a rainbow serpent reflects the significance of the movement for First Nations people, while simultaneously emphasises the role of the non-Indigenous population in creating a more accepting and tolerant society. However, in the longest memory, many enslaved humans have lost hope for equality. Whitechapel tells his great-granddaughter, "Africa is not for you," suggesting he has dissociated himself from his home country and believes his family should make their dreams here. His enslavers have created an environment that ensures Whitechapel loses his connection to his culture and therefore any aspiration to return to Africa or live with equal rights. Yet at the same time, it is Chapel and Lydia, as star-crossed lovers, who provide a glimpse into a better future, a heaven on earth. Dubois highlights their relationship, bound by acceptance and education, as aspirational and equal, endorsing a tolerant and just society. In this sense, both texts explore the cause and effect relationship between racism and hope. So for me, I thought again it was a considerate and relevant topic sentence, and a range of evidence was included too. I thought the structure though was a bit convoluted. So they talk about differences and then similarities, and it sort of touches only on the novel at the end there when they go back to the similarities. So in this case, I reckon looking at the similarities first and then discussing the differences might have been better. I also think their analysis could have been a bit more detailed at times. But again, it's a fraction short overall, so that's probably where adding a bit more information might be really useful to push this up to be at a similar level to main body paragraph number 2. But I think it's slightly better than main body paragraph 1 though in saying that. Here are just some phrases as well that you might want to use in terms of comparing the two texts. I won't read through these for you, but if you want to pause here and make some notes, I'm sure you'll be able to find some of these quite useful. All right, conclusions. This is pretty straightforward, I think. All you got to do is to restate your contention and your arguments. And if you really want to, maybe consider finishing on your overall view of the topic or even your best piece of analysis. For me though, consistency is the key. You want to make sure your contention and arguments are the same as they were throughout the essay. My comment about conclusions is you can lose marks from them, but you can't really gain marks from them. So tick the boxes, include all the relevant and right information, and make sure, of course, that it's accurate in that as well. But there's no need to bring in any new evidence. There's no need to bring in really any characters. Just the contention and the arguments is all that you need. Here's a sample conclusion. The Longest Memory and the 7 Stages of Grieving both explore the impact hope can play on an individual's identity. While oppressive authorities initially manipulate and violate minorities, leaving them devoid of hope, Dubois, Enoch and Mailman ultimately promote the opportunity for acceptance and tolerance in their depicted worlds. It is through support, acceptance and rebellion that freedom and equality are achievable for enslaved humans and First Nations people alike. So again, it ticks the boxes, it has the contention, it has their arguments, it does the job, and we can get out of there knowing that our main body is where we have impressed the examiners. All right, a few reminders about formal writing. Make sure you are writing in third person. No I, my, we, none of that. We're always in third person. I want you to avoid judgments where possible as well, remembering you are analysing the text, not evaluating the text. So don't tell me if Dubois does something really well or really poorly. I just want you to analyse what Dubois does. Use active voice rather than passive voice. so chapel's experiences rather than the experiences of chapel. Avoid slang terms, informal language, cliches or contradictions. It's a formal piece of writing, so we want formal tone. And just the last one, write out numbers 1 to 100, except of course for the text title. That's why I added this in there. The 7 stages of grieving, we use the number 7 in that title. But again, there's no hard and fast rules really about numbers in essay writing. So what are some common mistakes? For me, the not responding to the topic is one of those. So whether students have pre-prepared ideas that they write about, or whether they go off on tangents and start waffling about something completely unrelated to the topic, be wary of this. Make sure you are actively writing your essay. You want to avoid too much plot retell. You want to be concise. Any plot retell you should do in 1 sentence, maybe 2 max. Remember to look at similarities and differences. So many students simply focus on one of the 2 things. And avoid repeating evidence or analysis. This comes up a fair bit, especially when it comes to characters. Sometimes we see the same character in every main body paragraph and it gets very, very repetitive. So avoid this. All right, what are some ways to study? The first thing, read the texts as many times as you can. Ideally, you want to read it at least twice, or both texts at least twice. Build an idea or an example or a quotation bank and refer to it while you're writing initially. Look for those examples that are really adaptable and flexible, examples that work really well for a range of topics. I mentioned before the idea of shame. Mr. Whitechapel and the brother. I find that example works really well. It's a similarity and a difference, and it works on so many levels for so many different themes and topics. Make sure you are writing paragraphs and essays and seeking feedback from your teachers, and read any sample essays to gain ideas. The last thing, and I think this is really important, make sure you're speaking with your fellow students about these texts. There are 120 of you reading these texts and you will all have different ideas. Share those ideas, share your examples, share your essays, and build that textual knowledge so that you have it, or you have as many weapons as you can going into the exam. All right, over to you. Have a go at planning or writing an essay on one of the following topics, or maybe the topic we looked at before that was on the key theme of hope from last year's exam. Now, use anything from this video, speak to your classmates, speak to your teachers, whatever help you need, please don't be afraid to ask for it. But these are the 2 topics I might leave you with. The first one, how do both texts present pride as a motivating factor in dealing with grief? Bit of a double whammy here. We've got both pride and grief to deal with. And the last one, how do both texts examine the impact of memories? That topic we're going to look at in class in a little bit. That's all from me today though. Hopefully you learnt something or a few things today from this video. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch via email or the comments. I look forward to having you back at the 6Ps podcast very soon.